at the National Press Club, the former US Director of Intelligence, the Honourable James R. Clapper. He spent 5 decades in the armed forces, the private sector and in top government posts. He'll talk about the Australia-US alliance and the regional security challenges. James R. Clapper with today's National Press Club address.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. I'm Chris Uhlmann. Well, the evidence of Russian interference in the last American election has rarely been out of international headlines since November. It's claimed a national security advisor played a part in the dismissal of an FBI director and damaged a presidency, to say nothing of the damage that might have been done to a democracy by a hostile government. In Australia, we're in the midst of a debate over whether foreign donations from Chinese-linked sources might be undermining our political system. So with that backdrop, we could have no better guest today, a man with 50 years of public service. As we were speaking at the table, our guest today told me that his first president he served was President Kennedy. But he had an extraordinary career. The Honourable James Clapper is a retired Lieutenant General in the United States Air Force. And from 2010 to January 2017, he was the Director of National Intelligence. That's a cabinet-level official in charge of the US intelligence community. So will you please welcome Jim Clapper.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Well, before I get started, I do have to comment on the courtesy and gentility that is exhibited here by photographers, which is not the case in the United States. Customarily, when I testify, or when I did testify on Capitol Hill, an experience that I rank right up there with root canals or folding fitted sheets, and you'll have a bevy of photographers come out and they click, 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 click away, and they leave. And at least here, they do the same, but at least they thank you. So I had to comment on that. It is wonderful to be here. This is about as far away from Washington, D.C. as I can get and still be in civilization. And Washington, of course, a pretty dizzy place where friends come and go and enemies accumulate, and if you want a friend, you buy a dog, that sort of thing. So thanks so much for having me here today. It is indeed a great honor for me to have this privilege. Now, I do have some prepared remarks I'd like to deliver, but they'll probably be shorter, I think, than what you're traditionally used to. I've read some transcripts of events here at the Press Club, and I'm very aware of the and look forward to the famous frank and fearless Q&A session. Unfortunately, on a serious note, I am compelled to acknowledge the tragic loss of 2 Australian citizens in the mindless, heinous terrorist attack in London, and the anguish of the loved ones yet missing. So on behalf of the United States, I want to offer heartfelt condolences and prayers, and similar thoughts go out to the family of the man killed in Melbourne on Monday. Now, I'm here under the auspices of the National Security College of the Australian National University as a distinguished professor. I do that in air quotes. I will try my best to live up to such an impressive title. And I do need to pay tribute to Brian Schmidt, the Vice Chancellor, and Rory Metcalf, who's here with us today, who, for their great leap of faith in so designating me as a distinguished professor at ANU. And it is as well very fortuitous, I think, that I'm able to speak here so soon after Dennis Richardson, the now retired Defense Secretary, as he did on May 12th. So I want to pay tribute to Dennis and then key off some things that he said which I strongly resonate with. And that resonance may be just a function of our ages. And in doing so, I'll speak to the importance of the alliance between Australia and the United States, a conviction, by the way, reinforced by recent events in both of our countries, and a belief I've long held ever since I first came here in an early intelligence capacity in 1984, and subsequently reinforced during my 33-plus year association with Australia and the Australian national security establishment. My heartfelt support for the relationship between our two countries is, in fact, the major reason I'm here after leaving government as Director of National Intelligence on January 20th after almost 6.5 years. I will share with you that I received many mementos when I left that position, but none more meaningful to me than a statuette given me by Prime Minister Turnbull, replicating the iconic picture from World War II, depicting an Australian soldier carrying a wounded American soldier over his shoulder. I treasure this symbol of our binational bond and the Prime Minister's personal recognition of my long commitment to and staunch belief in our alliance. Now, Dennis Richardson is a friend and colleague of many years, and I pay tribute to him not just for his 48 years of distinguished public service to Australia, but for his manifest contributions to the bilateral alliance, as well as the broader Five Eyes alliance. Now, I'll give you just one specific example. Some years ago, when we in the United States, and I was a big proponent of this, sought to restore New Zealand to full-fledged membership in what I'll call the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, the concern of our policymakers in the United States was whether Australia would be supportive of that or not. And if Australia was not, we wouldn't get anywhere in the United States with restoring New Zealand as a fully equal member of the intelligence network. Were it not for Dennis's advocacy, it would not have happened. There were those here, and I had debates with them, who, for understandable reasons, were not in favor of doing this, but Dennis's persuasiveness with Prime Minister Howard and others in the Australian government helped carry the day. And this restoration of New Zealand as a full-fledged intelligence partner demonstrably strengthened the intelligence sharing among the Five Eyes nations and has accrued to our great mutual benefit. And this serves, in my mind, as just one legacy of Dennis's incredible career. Now, this is not in any way to imply that Dennis was not a stalwart proponent of Australia's sovereignty and best interests. He always was. I think his message when he spoke here was to articulate how Australia has always taken account of its own interests in the context of the alliance. As Dennis said, and I quote, "Australian governments have generally been pragmatic and hard-headed in weighing alliance considerations on matters of war and peace." Actually, that describes Dennis as well, especially the hard-headed part. And he went on to say, and I quote, "An intelligence sharing which has expanded enormously is perhaps better understood and appreciated by the Australian community than at any time." And these remarks, in my view, are emblematic of Dennis's huge impact and his pervasive influence, not only here, but in the alliance. And I would reciprocate here by saying his observation is very congruent with the appreciation of the U.S. intelligence community for Australia's contributions, now perhaps more than any previous time. And I say all this with profound respect and deep admiration for Dennis Richardson for what he has contributed, not only to the safety and security of Australia, but to the strength of our alliance. Now, lest you think I'm completely focused and completely consumed with intelligence, I do recognize and want to say publicly that intelligence is but one pillar of many which underpin the deep and pervasive foundation of our binational bond. Jim Caruso, our superb charge d'affaires, now leading the U.S. mission here, recently made this point in an excellent article in the Inquirer section of the Weekend Australian. And despite what you may hear, the United States is Australia's leading economic partner with our bilateral economic engagement at $1.9 trillion and growing. A similar point was made recently by my colleagues at the National Security College. They point out that the United States remains Australia's largest source of foreign investment and the #1 destination for Australian investment overseas. Now, I could go on about the other pillars, such as our defense relationship, which I'm also pretty familiar with, but you get the idea. And I'll speak more about the depth and breadth of the relationship between the United States and Australia at an event next week with another great friend and colleague, Kim Beazley. But I know you all want to hear about the current state of U.S. politics. So let me delve into that. I know, and I heard this here this morning, there's well-founded concern about our current administration and its emerging foreign policy generally towards this region and specifically towards Australia. And that's one reason I wanted to come here, and one reason I want to speak publicly. And by the way, it is in fact quite liberating to be free of the government harness, to be able to do that. Now, some truth in advertising is, at this point, I think is appropriate. I've toiled in the trenches of U.S. intelligence for every president since and including John F. Kennedy. 34 years of that were in the U.S. military, either briefly in the United States Marine Corps and subsequently for 32 years in the Air Force, and in a variety of civilian capacities since I left the military some 21 years ago. My professional instincts have always included and been premised on loyalty to the President, particularly in his capacity as our Commander-in-Chief, regardless of who it's been, regardless of what party he was in. I've served as a political appointee that is confirmed by our Senate in both Republican and Democratic administrations. So I consider myself largely apolitical. So it's not easy for me to be critical of a president. But as I said in a CNN interview a couple of weeks ago, now as a private citizen, I'm very concerned about the assault on our institutions coming from both an external source, read Russia, and an internal source, the President himself. So let me speak briefly first about the source of the external assault on our country. Russia embarked on a campaign to interfere with our presidential election, which was unprecedented in its directness and aggressiveness. The Russians have a long history of interfering in elections, theirs and other people's. They've tried to interfere in our elections going back to the 60s. But, let me stress, never like this, like they did in 2016. Apart from the infamous hacking of the Democratic National Committee, their campaign had many other dimensions. Social media trolls planning false information, orchestrated fake news, which many other news outlets picked up and amplified either wittingly or unwittingly, and a very sophisticated campaign by the regime-funded propaganda arm, the RT broadcasting arm, against Hillary Clinton and for Donald Trump. Their first objective, though, was to sow doubt, discontent, and discord about our political system. And they achieved, I'm sure, beyond their wildest expectations. And given their success, they have only been emboldened to be even more aggressive in the future. This is not, let me stress, fake news. The Russians are not our friends. They, and Putin specifically, despite his disingenuous denials, are avowedly opposed to our democracy and values and see us, particularly the United States, as the cause of all their problems and frustrations. I'd also point out some things about Russia that many in the United States I don't think have kept in appropriate perspective. The Russians are embarked on a very aggressive and disturbing program to modernize their strategic forces, notably their submarine and land-based nuclear forces. They've also made big investments in their counter space capabilities. They do all this despite their economic challenges with only one adversary in mind, the United States. And just for good measure, they are also in active violation of their intermediate range nuclear forces treaty. Interestingly, every one of the non-acting prime ministers of Russia since 1992 has come from one of two constituencies, either the oil and gas sector or the security services. To put this in perspective, as I've pointed out to U.S. audiences, suppose the last 10 or so presidents of the United States were either from the CIA or were chairman of ExxonMobil. But I think this gives you some insight into the dominant mindset of the leadership of the Russian government that has prevailed since at least 1992. So as a consequence of all this, I've had a real hard time reconciling the threat the Russians pose to the United States and by extension, Western democracies in general, with the inexplicably solicitous stance the Trump administration, or at least he himself as opposed to others in it, has taken with respect to Russia. Let me move to the internal assault on our institutions. And I'll share just two examples with you, and only because I have some personal knowledge of each of these examples. There are many others I could pick from. Then President-elect Trump disparaged the intelligence community's high-confidence assessment of the magnitude and diversity of this Russian interference that I just described by characterizing us as Nazis. This was prompted, I found, I realized later, by his and his team's extreme paranoia about and resentment of any doubt cast on the legitimacy of his election, which, of course, our assessment did. When he made this absurd allegation, I felt an obligation to defend the men and women of the U.S. intelligence community, so I called him on the phone on the 11th of January. And amazingly, he took my call. I tried, naively as it turned out, to appeal to his higher instincts by pointing out that the U.S. intelligence community that he was about to inherit is a national treasure in our country, and that the people in it were committed to supporting him and making him successful. Ever transactional, he simply asked me to publicly refute the infamous dossier, which I couldn't and wouldn't do. When I later learned, though, that the first place he was going to visit after his inauguration was CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, I thought, again naively, that perhaps I had gotten through to him. For the intelligence community, not just the Central Intelligence Agency in our country, the wall in the front lobby at the CIA headquarters is hallowed, with over 120 stars commemorating CIA officers who paid the ultimate price for their country. He chose to use that as a prop for railing about the size of the inauguration crowd on the Mall and his battle with the fake news media. His subsequent actions, sharing a sense of intelligence with the Russians and compromising its source, reflect either ignorance or disrespect, and either is very problematic. Similarly, the whole episode with the firing of Jim Comey, a distinguished public servant, apart from the egregious, inexcusable manner in which it was conducted, reflect complete disregard for the independence and autonomy of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, our premier law enforcement organization. And again, truth in advertising, Jim is a personal friend and a personal hero of mine. So as I said, I worry about these assaults on our institutions, and I've only talked about the two that I have some personal insight into. Finally, as long as I'm into controversial stuff, I do want to say a word about China. since I realize it is much more of a preoccupation here than Russia is. I do so because I see some striking parallels between what our two countries are experiencing at the hand of these two countries. I've seen just this week compelling evidence of potentially nefarious foreign interference in your democratic institutions and from where that interference apparently originates. For America, though, I consider China more benignly than I do Russia. Their economy is inextricably bound with ours as well as with yours. And with all the challenges that poses, I do think that fact serves somewhat to moderate China's behavior. But we and you, I think, need to be very wary. A few factoids on the growth of China's economic power, some of them lesser known, I think are illustrative. In 2004, 7 of the 10 largest companies in the world were American. There were no Chinese companies on that top 10 list until 2010. In 2016, it was 4 Chinese, 5 American, and 1 Japanese in the top 10 companies in the world. And 12 of the 15 largest Chinese companies today, of course, are state-owned and are accordingly potential intelligence platforms. In telecommunications, the 7 largest Chinese smartphone companies control 1/3 of the market worldwide, more than twice the market share of Apple. Now, this isn't just about market share, this is about intelligence gathering, since Chinese law allows and, in fact, implicitly encourages their intelligence services to use any and all communications and IT equipment for intelligence collection. In the summer of 2016, the United States was surpassed by China as #1 in the world for supercomputing. Even more startling was the suddenness of China's jump, with 5 times the manufacturing of supercomputers compared to just 1 year earlier. This has huge implications, particularly in the intelligence realm and for many other reasons. And with respect to foreign investment, since 2014, Chinese companies have acquired U.S. companies in 39 of our 50 states. Chinese investment in the United States tripled in 2016 compared to the previous year, some $46 billion. Now, I cite this litany not certainly to sermonize, but to share, since China poses somewhat similar challenges for both of our nations. The issue, I think, for both of us is how China employs this economic muscle and how we conduct ourselves accordingly. As Dennis Richardson forthrightly acknowledged, and as your news media has exposed this week, it is no secret that China is very active in intelligence activities directed against Australia, just as they are against us, and that China is increasingly aggressive in attempting to gain influence in your political processes as Russia is in ours. In light of all this, Australia, in my humble view, I acknowledge here I'm delving into your internal affairs here, but I care deeply about Australia too. But I believe that Australia should engage with China with both caution and confidence, eyes wide open, weighing its strategic and economic interests, never forgetting the importance of its democratic institutions and values that you share with us. Dennis summed it all up very succinctly and accurately. Australia's relationship with China and the United States will continue to be, and I quote, friends with both, allies with one, unquote. And I think in many ways that applies as well to how the United States should approach its relationships with China on the one hand and its historic security partners in the Asia-Pacific on the other. Attorney General George Brandis recently sounded a profoundly important warning, which I think also applies equally to both of our countries. And I quote, "The threat of political interference by foreign intelligence services is a problem of the highest order and is getting worse. It can cause immense harm to our national sovereignty, to the safety of our people, our economic prosperity, and to the very integrity of our democracy. I think that says it all. I know I've talked about Dennis a lot, but I know how much you all love him. I want to conclude with another very important statement Dennis made that I resonate with when he acknowledged the role of journalists. There is an inherent tension, certainly in our country, between the media and the intelligence community. And I've certainly had my own personal ups and downs with our media. But never has the media's role been more important in the United States than it is now. And a free, independent, and responsible press is yet another of the crucial pillars that bind our two countries and the values we share and hold dear, which far transcend a transitory occupant in our White House. So on that point, I'll stop and paraphrase from the slogan on that famous T-shirt that Dennis talked about, "It's time for questions." Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And can I just begin by asking, you were talking about the thing among many inexplicable things that we find watching Donald Trump from this distance is why is it that his administration seems so keen to be courting Russia? I don't think at least that part is denied. Can you explain that?
No, I can't. And I, in my remarks, characterize that as inexplicable. I don't understand that. There is, of course, now an investigation under the auspices of Bob Mueller, by the way, an inspired, brilliant choice to do that, whom I've also worked with, was Jim Comey's predecessor as a special counsel. And as I've often said, it is absolutely crucial for the United States, and for that matter, for the world, for this presidency, for the Republicans, for the Democrats, and for our nation at large, that we get to the bottom of this. You know, is there a smoking gun with all the smoke? And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's vital, though, that we find that out. And in the interim, no, I cannot explain this solicitousness of the Russians. During my one and only first and last ever, I'm sure, sojourn at Trump Tower, the then President-elect Trump commented to me that, you know, wouldn't it be a good thing if we could get along with the Russians? I said, sure. You know, whenever our interests converge, and they do occasionally, fine. But as far as our being intimate allies, trusting buds with the Russians, that is just not going to happen. It is in their genes to be opposed, diametrically opposed to the United States and the Western democracies.
The ABC.
Jim Clapper, Andrew Green from the ABC. I'll take you to China, where you ended your speech, and the sale of the Darwin port, or a 99-year lease of Darwin port. Can I get an insight into your reaction and the American intelligence community's reaction to that development, and also your feelings about a former Australian Trade Minister going to work for the Chinese company that has that 99-year lease within weeks of leaving our federal parliament?
Well, you're drawing me into a place where I'm somewhat loath to go, which is critiquing internal decisions that are made here. With respect to the 99-year lease at Darwin, yes, we were concerned about that, and I brought that up, raised that with with Dennis and Duncan Lewis, and I said, you know, this is an Australian decision, and all I would hope is that you have considered, you know, all the equities involved here, and I was assured that was the case. We have our own challenges in the United States. First, just with the visibility of the aggressive Chinese attempts to acquire companies and concerns, particularly those which could have potential national security implications. And we have a mechanism for doing that, which probably needs modernization and update to be more nimble and also more aware of the magnitude of Chinese incursions in our economic incursions in our country. So sure, we're concerned about that. Australia is a close ally and a close intelligence ally. And so if there is any impact on that, by definition, we're concerned. But in the spirit of our frank and candid relationship, we aired that out, and I went away satisfied that those concerns had been attended to.
Can I put you a parallel? Would you sell a strategic asset like a port in the United States to the Chinese? Well,
we've tried to, the Chinese have made similar attempts, particularly when it comes to an acquisition of what we would consider part of our critical infrastructure, and certainly a port would. And so through our CFIUS mechanism, we have tried to raise, if not red flags, certainly yellow flags about the efficacy of making such deals. So it's again a problem I think we share. And so in our country, we argue we have these debates about. It gets down to the specific companies that, when we learn of it, that the Chinese want to buy. And in some cases, we found out about these deals after they've been consummated, which is, I've learned, very difficult to undo legally once a deal has been consummated. So this is one case where first order business is vigilance.
The Australian.
Hi there, thank you so much for your speech. My name is Primrose Redden and I'm from The Australian. My question is also in regards to China. You spoke a little bit about Chinese SOEs and economic leverage. What material steps do you think should be taken or could be taken to stop interference and propaganda or that kind of fake news, that kind of idea, as well as the control of the diaspora press? And secondly, on the use of social media encryption apps by terrorists, what do you think should be done in terms of getting cooperation from some of these companies,
right,
that kind of thing?
Well, what can be done? Well, one thing is it appears is being done is to maybe not accept donations from foreign countries. We've gone through this in our country. It's hard for me to understand why that serves the interests of democratic institutions when you have foreign government. And I'm not, by the way, this is a general comment, not targeting China, but any foreign country. What is the benefit in a democratic system having a foreign nation buying influence in the political processes of your country or our country or any? So that's one thing, I think one very specific thing that can be done. I've been an advocate in our country for education of the public. This is a real challenge in our country, but to alert people to help them recognize fake news, or to at least do some fact checking. Recognize the potential for paid trolls spreading misinformation on social media. Awareness of the very slick and sophisticated RT propaganda approach. And all that has to do with, it comes around awareness public awareness and educating the public. As far as censoring diaspora media, that's I think, a very sensitive area, since in our system, at least, there is the principle of freedom of speech, even if we don't like the speech. But I think that's another area that we have to be very mindful of. We don't want to compromise civil liberties and privacy. With respect to the second issue on encryption, this too is a major issue in our country. The so-called going dark phenomenon, a situation that was dramatically accelerated by the Snowden revelations. And in our country, I don't think we're in a good place here. I think there needs to be a very serious dialogue about giving criminals, terrorists, rapists, murderers, etc., a pass. I would hope that at some point our technology industry would use all the creativity and innovation and energy that they apply to create such miraculous technological things as iPhones, the center of my life now, that they would apply that same creativity, innovation to figuring out a way that both the interests of privacy as well as security can be guaranteed. I don't know what the answer is. I am not an IT geek, but I just don't think we're in a very good place right now.
Fairfax.
Jim, David Rowe from The Age and Sydney Morning Herald. Thanks for your address and welcome to Australia again. You have painted a picture of extraordinary dysfunction in Washington. You've talked about the assault on institutions. It's very tempting to believe that however the Trump administration plays out, things won't quite be the same again afterwards. Now, I mean, we can have a debate about how that will affect the US's external relations, but if you look at one of the more troubling remarks recently of Angela Merkel, and there have been plenty of troubling remarks recently, but Angela Merkel, who's not given to rash or reckless remarks, says, basically Europe will need to rely on itself. Australia does not really have that option. We're a middle power. We're not part of any natural geographic or strategic grouping. We do have an enormous amount of eggs in one large strategic basket, as it were. I wonder if you could just reflect on that situation that Australia faces right now in terms of its future decision making, and do we need to hedge against US unreliability in the future? Do we need a plan B?
Well, obviously you've asked a key question and one that is somewhat of imponderable. I'm ever the optimist, so I do have great faith and confidence in our, even though they're under assault, in our basic institutions. That is not unlimited, though. So the question is, how long can these assaults go on and the institutions not be irrevocably damaged, which I think is the essence of your point here. And I honestly can't say. There are people in the administration that I think can be trusted, and Jim Mattis and John Kelly and H.R. McMaster, all military people, which that's another issue which I have concerns with, but nevertheless they are great Americans, and they do have understanding and respect for our institutions. Again, I'm loath to, give advice to Australia. It's rather presumptuous of me, but I just think Australia has to keep on and make decisions based on Australia's best national interests. I have to say that I think Prime Minister Turnbull has found the balance between being very tactful with our president, but at the same time not compromising Australia's interests and its sovereignty. So what I look to Australia and other staunch allies like Australia is perhaps to help fill whatever void is created by the absence of U.S. leadership.
Crikey.
Bernard Keane from Crikey. Mr. Clapper, thank you for your remarks today. I want to go back to Primrose's question touching on encrypted communications. This issue comes up a lot. You've spoken about it before in your role as Director of National Intelligence. It seems to come up every time there's a terrorist attack. It's come up just in the wake of what happened in London with both Theresa May and our own Prime Minister talking about the need to access encrypted communications. This time, however, it's come up in the wake of not one but two incidences where major intelligence agencies have lost control of their hacking tools. The CIA lost a trove which turned up at WikiLeaks. The NSA lost a trove that turned up with shadow brokers and was presumably involved in what turned out to be a hacking attack that affected a lot of Western Europe recently. Is it not a fair assumption then to say that this debate should be held in the context of an understanding that it is almost impossible, if not outright impossible, to keep backdoors, whether developed by intelligence agencies or by Apple, Microsoft et al., secure, meaning that if they are developed, there's a very good chance that they'll end up in the hands of the very people that we want to use those backdoors against?
That's a great question, and if I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be here, I think. And that has been certainly the bane of my, one of the many banes of my existence in my last job as DNI is these very, very damaging leaks. And so on one hand, we've done what we can to detect them earlier. In this recent case of Reality Winner, strange name, but is a case in point where she was identified pretty quickly. So we've made a lot of investments in the United States on insider threat detection, which will not prevent people from attempting to leak. All it can do is staunch the hemorrhage earlier, and that's about the best that we can hope for. One of the approaches that might have promise, I don't know, would be circle back on a system of key escrow, where not one party necessarily would have the keys to the kingdom from an encryption standpoint, where there might be, say, 3 independent, separate, autonomous elements that would have to approve the provision of encryption in order to solve a crime or detect a terrorist attack, for example. We had some discussions about that in the waning days of the Obama administration. And again, I'm not a techie, but that appears to me to have some promise. But this issue of exploiting vulnerabilities, and then do you share them with the provider immediately or not, or use that vulnerability to collect critical intelligence, is a crucial issue. There is no single right answer for that. But I don't have a silver bullet solution to the question you raised, which is a very good one. I just know that, as I said earlier, we're not in a good place right now. We did have set up what we call an equities process, whereby when these vulnerabilities are discovered, and we make a conscious decision. So it's not just a careless thing, it's a conscious decision. Do we play that vulnerability back to the provider in order to patch it or correct it? Or if we are deriving really crucial, critical, life-saving intelligence from by exploiting that vulnerability. And at least we have established a decision mechanism to try to make those kind of judgments. But I don't know the ultimate answer here.
The Australian Financial Review.
Mr. Clapper, Andrew Tillett from the AFR, how are you? Thank you very much for your speech. Just talking about leaks, as you alluded, we had the furor over what Donald Trump may or may not have told the Russian ambassador and foreign minister with passing on classified information obtained by Israeli intelligence services. Given the concern about that, do you think that intelligence services like Australia's and other Five Eyes partners would be justified in holding back information that they share with the Americans, or do you think that the personal relationships between officials would perhaps overcome those sorts of fears?
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's a question within the U.S. because there's been concern expressed about will this sort of thing inhibit U.S. intelligence officials, officers from, passing information up to the White House. And institutionally, no, and I don't believe that'll happen. Even though I'm sure at a personal level, there are many in the U.S. intelligence community that do harbor those concerns. As far as other foreign partners are concerned, you'll have to make your own judgments. Australia and any other countries we share with will have to make their own judgments about that. I would hope that wouldn't happen. Certainly at the institutional intelligence community to intelligence community level, we don't want that to happen. But to some extent, it's reaches a certain level where it's out of our control. So I hope it doesn't happen, but I could certainly understand if it did. And that's a judgment that each and every national government will have to make. I will say that in my 50-plus years in the intel business, I don't know of a time where we have shared more pervasively and more thoroughly than we do today. And it would be a shame if that were jeopardized or set back.
The West Australian.
Thank you for your talk, Mr. Clapper. I just wanted to pick up something you said in response to one of the early questions about not being sure how long American institutions can survive sustained aggression from the executive. I mean, are you saying that you don't believe in the end they could if an aggressive executive were to make a sustained assault on them? And if that's the case, what advice are you giving to your former colleagues and peers in the US about the best way to maintain their independence in the face of an executive that seems keen on tearing them down?
Well, I can speak to intelligence as just one institution where it is quite, I think, a critical tenet is bound up in the phrase truth to power. And I think it's absolutely essential that the intelligence community leadership hew to that, and that always, that you don't slant, politicize, water down, tone up, whatever phrase you want to use, intelligence information. And that would, if that were to happen, that would be an erosion of at least the institution of intelligence in our country. And it's my impression from the discussions I had with former Senator Dan Coates, who succeeded me as Director of National Intelligence, that he believes in that. That is huge. Because if that is, that's not adhered to, that is a bad sign for at least that one institution.
SBS.
Hi, Mr. Clapper. Miles Morgan from SBS News. You touched on Melbourne before, and I just want to take you back to that incident in Melbourne. There's a debate in Australia about whether criminals with known terrorist links or past should be released from detention under any circumstances. What's your view on whether these sorts of people should be released after they've served their sentences if there's a risk they pose, a risk to the public?
Well, once again, I'm being asked to speak about a sensitive domestic issue here in Australia. This is a challenge, and I'll answer it, I guess, based on the United States. This is an issue for us as well. One of the things that I encountered in my 6.5 years, whenever we'd have some terrorist incident, Boston Marathon comes readily to mind. And of course, inevitably, we do a post-mission, a post-event critique. And in this case, we had 3 inspectors general from the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and my inspector general got together and ran a tri-IG assessment of Boston Marathon bombing and the run-up to it. And so, I'm paraphrasing here, but one of the major conclusions from that critique was that the intelligence community, and specifically the FBI, was not invasive enough, which is in stark contrast to post-Snowden revelations, where, of course, we were skewered for being way too invasive in civil liberties and privacy. In fact, one of my takeaways from my experience as DNI was the mixed messages that the U.S. intelligence community gets from the American public about, well, we don't want any terrorist attacks, but we don't in any way want our civil liberties and privacy infringed upon. About 3 years ago, I spoke at a trade association thing, and I said, it appears to me that the expectation of the U.S. intelligence community placed upon it by the U.S. public is that we are to provide timely, accurate, relevant, anticipatory intelligence, but do it in such a way that there is absolutely no risk, and do it in such a way that if revealed, there's no embarrassment. Do it in such a way that if there's revelations, no foreign leader gets mad at us, and do it in such a way that there isn't even the scintilla of jeopardy to anyone's civil liberties and privacy. We call this new paradigm for intelligence immaculate collection. And I say that humorously to make the point about the mixed messages that the intelligence and law enforcement communities get from our publics. And I suspect that it's somewhat the same here.
AM.
Mr. Clapper, hello. Sabra Lane from the ABC's program AM. 2 questions for you. First off, when do you think the world will run out of patience with President Trump? He's trashed allies, he's shared intelligence. What do you think it will take for their patience to say enough? And did the election of Mr. Trump surprise you? This, the voters being over with the elites in Washington. Do you think the parties, the Democrats, the grand old party, have got that message yet?
Well, when you say when will the international community say enough, I think, frankly, the more direct question is the first order question is when will the United States, and particularly the Republicans, say enough? And I don't know the answer to that. I think, from what I've seen and heard, I think there is already a fairly high level of angst and exasperation already internationally. And to answer your question, no, I wasn't surprised. I haven't been surprised really at all once he was elected. His election was a big shock. I was happened to be in Oman on a trip, so I stayed up and watched the election results, and it was actually a personal shock to me about how disconnected apparently I was from what I'll call the flyover part of the United States. And there's a very, very a strong body of resentment and frustration in our country with Washington writ large. And so far, the base of people that, the coalition of people that elected President Trump are still there. They're still hanging in there. So I don't know what it will take. We'll just have to see. So this, very interested to see what happens with Jim Comey's hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee. And what I think it'll be very significant to see what both what he says and what he's asked about and doesn't respond to. He's in a tough place from that standpoint. I think he will be somewhat constrained by, I'm just guessing here, I don't have any inside baseball, or I guess I'd say inside cricket here, on what kind of guidelines that have been worked out between Jim and Bob Mueller.
Fairfax.